Hey guys, tonight we stand beneath a sky that looks almost too calm to have caused so much longing. The moon is there, pale and unhurried, hanging above rooftops, oceans, deserts, and sleeping towns as if it has always known you would eventually look up and wonder how close it really is. It seems gentle from here, a quiet lamp, a silver coin, something decorative, almost polite. And yet for most of human history, it was the great unreachable thing, the bright object that followed travelers home and watched over kings, sailors, farmers, insomniacs, poets, and people eating cold leftovers in their kitchens at midnight. Before you get cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here with me. And if you feel like it, post your location and local time in the comments, because there is something comforting about knowing where in the world you are listening from while we all look up at the same moon. Let the world slow down for a moment. Let the fan murmur softly nearby, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. For a very long time, the moon belonged to the category of things that were admired rather than visited. You could write songs about it. You could blame it for strange behavior. You could use it to mark time, guide planting seasons, inspire myths, or light the road home. But you could not go there. That was the arrangement. Earth was home. The moon was the watcher. The distance between them was so large that it barely felt like distance at all. It felt more like a rule. And then, slowly, stubbornly, people began to treat that rule as a technical problem. That shift is one of the most soothing and astonishing things about the missions to the moon. They were not born from one perfect flash of genius. They grew from a long chain of people asking a dangerous, almost childish question with very adult seriousness. What if we actually tried? What if that bright thing in the sky was not just scenery, but a destination? What if the gap between wonder and arrival could be measured, calculated, rehearsed, and crossed? At first, the idea sounded like something that belonged in pulp magazines with dramatic covers and men wearing fishbowl helmets. The kind of future that always looks slightly overconfident in old illustrations. You can almost hear the artist saying, yes, of course there will be a city on the moon by 1982, and of course everyone will wear silver boots for no reason. Real life, as usual, turned out to be less stylish and more complicated. There were no grand marble staircases in space. There were wires, fuel lines, cramped capsules, checklists, human sweat, missed sleep, scratched notes, static in headsets, and coffee going cold in fluorescent rooms at impossible hours. That is part of what makes a story feel so close and human. The path to the moon was built in offices, laboratories, test stands, and control rooms by people who were brilliant, tired, worried, under pressure, and probably at least once mildly annoyed by a jam printer or a bad sandwich. The moon remained majestic. The work to reach, it was often gloriously unglamorous. Long before anyone touched lunar dust, the dream had to survive the awkward phase where it looked ridiculous. Rockets exploded. Systems failed. Engineers argued. Politicians grandly declared things and then expected physics to cooperate on schedule, which is always a bold move. The early space age had the energy of a species try to learn how to stand on one leg while balancing a lit stove on its head. There was courage, yes, but also improvisation, fear, and a very serious relationship with the phrase, "we are testing the limits." Still, each attempt changed the scale of what seemed possible. A person went into orbit, then another. Space stopped being purely theoretical and became a place where human beings could work, breathe, sweat, think, and return with stories. Missions grew longer. Maneuvers grew more precise. Capsules separated and rejoined. Astronauts learned how to move in weightlessness without looking like laundry in a breeze. Bit by bit, the impossible stopped feeling impossible and started feeling merely very, very difficult, which is an entirely different mood. That mood mattered. Difficult can be planned for. Difficult can be practiced. Difficult can be funded, argued over, delayed, improved, and eventually done. There was also the enormous emotional engine behind it all, the feeling that the future had arrived and was waiting impatiently at the door. In the 1960s, the moon was not just a scientific destination. It was a test of nerve, imagination, and national will. It sat above the world like a challenge, coin tossed onto a table. The message was simple enough to stir millions of people and stressful enough to age an entire generation of engineers. Get there. And so the moon began to feel closer in a very strange way. Not physically, not yet. It still hovered nearly 250,000 miles away, cold and airless, and perfectly indifferent to speeches. But psychologically, it moved inward. It entered television broadcasts, classroom posters, dinner table conversations, factory schedules, military calculations, newspaper headlines, and the private daydreams of children staring through windows after bedtime. It became less of a myth and more of a future appointment. Imagine what that must have felt like. The same moon your grandparents had known as distant decoration was suddenly being discussed in terms of trajectories, launch windows, rendezvous techniques, heat shields, and landing strategies. It is one thing to admire the moon. It is another thing entirely to hear calm voices explaining how many seconds an engine should burn if you intend to visit it and come home alive. That is when the old boundary begins to dissolve. The moon is no longer out there in the abstract. It is on a schedule, and the people responsible for that schedule had to operate in a climate of breathtaking pressure. They were trying to build machines that could leave the Earth, protect fragile human bodies in an environment that absolutely did not want them there, navigate through the dark with tiny margins for error, and somehow make the whole thing look organized enough to justify the budget. It is hard enough to catch a train when you're under stress. These people were trying to hit another world. The remarkable thing is how often the work was carried by quiet concentration rather than cinematic drama. Popular memory loves the flames, the countdowns, the giant rockets trembling with power. Those images deserve their place. But just behind them, and sometimes more moving than them, is the sight of someone hunched over a console at 2 in the morning, someone checking numbers again, because almost right is not right enough, someone listening for a tiny irregularity in a sea of expected noise. The moon was approached not only with courage, but with patience. Patience is not usually the first word people associate with spaceflight. Rockets do not exactly whisper, but patience was everywhere. It lived in simulations repeated until the motions became instinct. It lived in test programs that seemed endless until one small improvement made another possible. It lived in astronauts' learning systems so thoroughly that switches and procedures became part of their breathing. It lived in the acceptance that one grand leap would actually require thousands of smaller, less glamorous ones. That is where the story becomes especially restful in a strange way. Not because it is dull, far from it, but because it replaces fantasy with craftsmanship. The moon did not become reachable through magic or destiny. It became reachable because people kept narrowing uncertainty. They studied what happens when a body is weightless. They studied how machines behave in vacuum. They studied heat, stress, vibration, fuel, human error, communication delays, re-entry angles, and the many creative ways hardware can betray your optimism. They kept learning, and learning has its own quiet rhythm. By the time the moon missions were gathering real momentum, the distance between Earth and Moon had acquired a new texture in the human mind. It was still immense, but no longer mystical in the old sense. It was a route. A hazardous route. Yes, a route lined with risk and possibility, but a route all the same. Once that happens, wonder does not disappear. It deepens. The moon becomes more beautiful, not less, because you begin to understand what it would take to stand there. You see it with both awe and engineering. And then there is the emotional contradiction that makes these missions so compelling even now. The closer humanity came to the moon, the more the Earth itself began to look tender, reaching outward sharpened affection for home. The ambition was enormous, but the feeling inside, it was often intimate. Families listened to broadcasts. Children watched grainy footage. People sat in living rooms as if history might knock over a lamp on the way through. The entire effort was global theater, but also something softer. Millions of private acts of attention focused on one bright object in the sky. The moon felt close because people had decided, collectively and seriously, to stop treating it like a symbol and start treating it like a place. That decision changed everything. It changed language. It changed expectations. It changed the emotional shape of the night sky. After that, whenever someone looked up, the moon was no longer only the lantern of poems and legends. It was also the destination of checklists, the target of guidance systems, the focus of sleepless teams in white shirts and thin ties, the place that human beings were preparing to meet face to face. And there is something wonderfully humbling in that. The first great step toward the moon was not a footprint. It was a change in thought. A species looked at an old companion in the sky and, with all the nerve and absurd courage it could gather, said, "Perhaps that is not beyond us after all." That single shift carries an almost magical calm. The moon did not move. Earth did not move closer. Human imagination simply matured into intention. The unreachable became measurable. The dream acquired paperwork. Mystery shook hands with mathematics. And somewhere in the middle of all that, beneath fluorescent lights, beside ashtrays, coffee cups, draft tables, and humming equipment, the future began to feel real enough to touch. Once the moon had shifted from distant decoration to an actual destination, the next problem was almost offensively practical. You needed a machine big enough to leave Earth. Not simply a good machine, not a brave machine, not a machine with an inspiring slogan and a nice logo on the side. You needed a machine so powerful that it could lift human beings, fuel, oxygen, food, guidance systems, radios, wiring, computers, water, survival gear, and a small mountain of ambition through the grip of Earth's gravity and send it all toward another world. This is the moment where the story stops feeling like a dream sketched in a notebook and starts feeling like heavy industry at its most dramatic. That machine was the Saturn V, and even its name sounds like it expects a spotlight. It was enormous in a way that almost resists language. You can give measurements, and people do, because measurements are helpful and honest, but numbers alone do not fully explain what it means to stand near a rocket that tall. It rose like architecture with a pulse. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a vertical decision. The kind of thing a civilization builds when it has decided that ordinary scale is no longer going to be enough. It did not sit on the launch pad, so much as dominated. White and black against the Florida sky, improbably elegant for something designed to explode in a very controlled and socially acceptable manner. And that is part of its strange beauty. Rockets are violent. There is no getting around that. A moon rocket is essentially a highly disciplined avalanche of fuel and engineering that hurls delicate life upward by making fire behave with exquisite manners. It is one of the most reassuring and unsettling ideas humans have ever turned into hardware. The Saturn V was built around this paradox. It had to be brutal enough to break free of Earth, and precise enough not to kill everyone inside while doing it. The people who designed and operated it understood that they were asking metal, fuel, electronics, and timing to perform a kind of symphony under impossible pressure. Nothing about it could be casual. Every valve, seam, wire bundle, tank wall, engine start sequence, structural joint, and separation event had to do its job exactly when required. A tiny error in a small place could become a very large problem in a very large sky. There is something almost soothing in the seriousness of that level of care. Nobody involved got to be vague. The rocket demanded clarity from everyone. Seen from a distance, the Saturn V looked calm. That is one of its great visual tricks. In photographs, it stands upright with the stillness of a monument, as if it has all the time in the world. You could almost imagine it posing. Underneath that stillness was an outrageous amount of stored energy. The fuel alone gives the whole thing a faintly mythical quality. Tanks were packed with propellants that would be consumed in minutes, all to create the short, overwhelming power needed to start the trip. So much preparation for such a brief, decisive burst. It is very human, really. Years of work arrange around a few moments where everything has to happen cleanly. Launch day carried a mood all its own. Not just excitement, though there was plenty of that, and not just fear, though fear was always lurking in the corners like a polite guest pretending not to listen. There was also ritual. The movement toward launch had the rhythm of something rehearsed so often that it became almost ceremonial. Teams checked systems. Weather was watched. Procedures unfolded. Voices stayed level. In the control rooms, people sat before their consoles with the cultivated calm of professionals who know that panic is not a method. The rocket stood outside like a giant candle waiting for the match. And then came the countdown, which has become so familiar in popular memory that it almost risks sounding theatrical. But in reality, it was functional, practical, and loaded with concentration. Every second meant something. Every pause had weight. The final moments before ignition must have felt both too fast and impossibly slow, the mind catching on tiny details because the larger truth was too big to comfortably hold. 3 human beings sat at the top of this tower of fuel and machinery, strapped into a capsule no roomier than comfort would recommend, while below them rested enough force to shake air, ground, and confidence at the same time. When the engines lit, the rocket did not leap instantly away. That is one of the details people often find surprising. The ignition built into a gathering thunder. Fire burst below. The structure seemed to come alive from the bottom upward. It was less like a jump and more like a decision becoming visible. For a brief moment, the Saturn V appeared to hold itself there, as if thinking about it with tremendous seriousness. It began to rise. That lift was slow at first, almost stately, which feels deeply unfair, really, because you are looking at one of the most powerful machines ever built, and it leaves the ground with the measured dignity of a cathedral deciding to float. But that slowness is part of what made it unforgettable. You could see the effort. You could feel that Earth was not giving up easily. The rocket climbed through its own storm, wrapped in light and sound, carrying human beings farther from the familiar world than anyone had ever gone. The noise was beyond ordinary experience. People who witnessed launches spoke of hearing it in the body as much as in the ears. The sound rolled across the landscape and struck the chest like weather with intent. Windows trembled. Air shivered. It was not just loud. It was physical. And yet within that tremendous violence, everything depended on grace. The rocket had to remain stable. Guidance had to stay true. Engines had to keep their rhythm. Vibrations had to remain within tolerances. The astronauts had to trust that this controlled earthquake beneath them was unfolding exactly as planned. That trust was hard-earned. Nobody simply sat on top of a Saturn V because it looked convincing from a distance. These missions depended on test after test, revision after revision, countless inspections, simulations, static fires, analyses, and uncomfortable questions asked by people who preferred embarrassment on the ground to catastrophe in the sky. The rocket's elegance did not come from simplicity. It came from complexity made obedient. The Saturn V was built in stages, which is a very calm way of handling a very unreasonable challenge. Instead of trying to haul the entire rocket all the way to the moon in one unchanged form, engineers treated the ascent like a shedding of burdens. The first stage did the hardest, rudest work, forcing the vehicle off the pad and through the thick lower atmosphere. Once its job was done, it fell away. Then the second stage took over, pushing higher and faster. Then the third stage prepared the spacecraft for orbit and, at the right moment, for the long burn that would send it toward the moon. There is something almost philosophical in that arrangement. To go farther, you let parts of the journey drop behind you. Even the staging itself had a kind of strange choreography. Massive pieces separated in the sky with explosive bolts and mechanical precision, each event timed and trusted. For the astronauts inside, these transitions were not abstract engineering concepts. They were felt as changes in motion, sound, and force. One stage would cut off, and for a fleeting instant there might be a sense of suspension, followed by the ignition of the next. Imagine sitting inside a machine that is calmly discarding entire portions of itself over the Atlantic, because that is simply what a moon voyage requires. It does make airport travel seem a bit overdramatic by comparison. And still, amid all this machinery, the human scale never vanished. At the top of the Saturn V sat the command module, where the crew rode through launch pressed into their couches, surrounded by controls, readouts, procedures, and the close presence of one another. They were not passengers in the ordinary sense. They were deeply trained participants in everything unfolding around them. They monitored the rocket, spoke with mission control, and lived moment by moment inside a machine whose performance had to remain near perfect. It was not serene in the simple sense. It was serene in the disciplined sense, where calm is something practiced until it can survive inside thunder. The deeper you look, the more the Saturn V begins to feel less like a blunt instrument and more like an expression of confidence made physical. It was not elegant because it was quiet. It was elegant because so many forces were coordinated toward one purpose. Its shape, its staging, its engines, its guidance, its timing, all of it served the single act of getting fragile humans off the Earth and placing them on a path to the moon. That is a beautiful thing, even if it arrives trailing enough flame to convince the local wildlife that civilization has finally lost its mind. And there was something unmistakably emotional in seeing it rise. The launch was not just a technical success or failure. It was the visible moment when years of hidden labor turned into motion. Every mathematician, machinist, welder, navigator, seamstress, technician, engineer, pilot, planner, and controller had a small piece in that upward movement. The rocket carried more than a crew. It carried the concentrated work of thousands of hands and minds, all briefly made visible in one pillar of light. Then the sky began to darken around it. The atmosphere thinned. The violence of the lower climb gave way, little by little, to a quieter kind of speed. The rocket was still performing, still shedding stages, still obeying its equations, but the mood was already changing. Earth was falling away beneath the spacecraft. The launch tower, the coast, the ocean, the waiting crowds, the cameras, the shaking windows, all of it was receding into the ordinary world below. Up ahead was the blackness where the next part of the journey would begin, and with it a very different sensation from the storm of launch. The giant machine had done what it was born to do. It had taken fire, discipline, and absurd courage, and turned them into departure. After all that force and noise, one of the loveliest surprises of the moon missions is how quickly the journey could turn quiet. The Saturn V had spent its fury. Stage by stage, that giant machine had done its work and fallen away. And what remained was smaller, calmer, and far more delicate-looking than the violence that had launched it. The crew was no longer being hurled upward through roaring atmosphere. They were in space, truly in space, circling Earth at impossible speed in a silence, so complete it almost feels fictional when you first hear about it. This is the part people sometimes forget when they think about moon travel. They remember the launch, the landing, the famous words, the grainy television pictures. But between Earth and Moon, there was a long stretch of floating time, and much of it had an almost dreamlike stillness. Once the spacecraft was safely in Earth orbit, there was still one major act left before the coast began in earnest. The third stage had to fire again and send the crew out of orbit and onto a path toward the moon. This maneuver had an official name, of course, with the kind of crisp technical dignity space programs enjoy, but the emotional truth of it is simpler. This was the moment they actually left home. Until then, they were still wrapped in Earth's embrace, only moving around it. After that burn, they were falling away from Earth and heading into the deep black between worlds. That must have felt strange in a way language can only partly catch. You are strapped into a machine built by other people, watching instruments, hearing calm voices, and then a precisely timed engine burn changes your relationship with the universe. Home stops being the center beneath you and becomes something you are leaving behind. Not forever, thankfully, This is not one of those stories where someone dramatically stares into infinity and abandons their mortgage. But still, the shift is enormous. Earth becomes a place behind you. The moon becomes a place ahead. And almost immediately, the trip settles into something unexpectedly ordinary. Not ordinary in the sense that anyone could do it before breakfast, obviously. Nobody was casually commuting to lunar orbit with a packed lunch and a thermos. But inside the spacecraft, once the major maneuvers were complete and the systems were behaving, life took on a rhythm. The astronauts were no longer enduring the crushing vibration of launch. They were floating. Weightlessness transformed everything. Pins drifted. Checklists had to be secured. Food behaved with the personal boundaries of a curious insect. A simple movement could send you gently across the cabin. Your body, which had spent its entire life assuming that down would continue to be available, had to accept that down had taken a leave of absence. That change alone gave the voyage a strange softness. On Earth, every action is a negotiation with gravity. In space, actions become lighter and sometimes a little absurd. A person reaching for an object might end up rotating like a slow, thoughtful ballet student who has misplaced the floor. You can picture the astronauts learning once again how to inhabit their bodies, except this time inside a tiny machine falling through blackness toward another world. There was something funny about that, and humor mattered. The crews were serious men doing serious work, but they were also very capable of appreciating the quiet ridiculousness of daily life in zero gravity. That helped. It is easier to live inside the extraordinary when you can still laugh at a floating napkin. The command and service module was not spacious. Nobody would have described it as a luxury suite. It was compact, functional, crowded with equipment, controls, storage, bags, and the close presence of two other human beings. Privacy was basically a philosophical concept. Comfort was real, but measured against circumstances rather than furniture. Yet over the days of the journey, the crews shaped routines inside that tight environment. They checked systems. They talked to mission control. They ate. They cleaned up as best they could. They prepared for later tasks. They rested. They looked out the windows. Again and again, the voyage was carried not by constant spectacle, but by the quiet competence of routine. That routine is one of the most relaxing parts of the lunar missions to think about. Deep space, in popular imagination, is often portrayed as dramatic every second, all alarms and flashing lights, and people shouting about oxygen. In reality, the crews often spent long periods doing careful, measured work and then waiting. Spaceflight requires patience. Once you're on course, you do not flap your arms at the stars and improvise. You monitor. You verify. You conserve. You float in a capsule surrounded by instruments, while millions of miles of nothing remain deeply uninterested in your schedule. Outside the windows was a view so astonishing that it could easily have overwhelmed the practical business of simply living. Earth was shrinking behind them. At first it would still have looked large, detailed, richly familiar. Clouds, oceans, swirls of weather. That particular blue that almost seems too beautiful to be accidental. Over time it drew farther away and began to gather into a more complete shape, more globe than landscape. People often talk about the emotional effect of seeing Earth from space, and for good reason. From a distance, the planet looks both grand and fragile. Borders disappear. The noise of human arguments does not rise that far. There is just this luminous world hanging in darkness, full of everyone you know and everyone you do not, every city, every shore, every birthday cake, every awkward family dinner, every child asleep in a small bed, all gathered onto one shining sphere. No wonder the crews kept looking. And ahead, still distant but growing, was the moon. During the coast phase, it did not rush toward them like a movie prop. Space is far too patient for that. The approach was gradual. The moon remained a presence rather than an immediate arrival, a pale destination waiting at the end of a long, black corridor. That long corridor is important to imagine properly. The route between Earth and Moon was not crowded with scenery. There were no glowing signposts or dramatic nebulae floating conveniently past the windows. There was darkness, sunlight, stars, and the presence of these two worlds marking the ends of the journey. The emptiness itself became part of the experience. Yet that emptiness was not always harsh. There's a calm in it. Once the body adjusts, once the systems are stable, once the tasks are understood, the spacecraft becomes a tiny island of human order moving through vast silence. Fans hum. Instruments glow. Radio voices come and go. A food packet is opened. A joke is shared. Someone checks a reading. Someone else peers through the glass and falls quiet for a while. This is not the peace of a forest or a beach. It is a mechanical peace held together by switches and seals and confidence in engineering. But it is still peace. Sleeping in that environment had its own strange quality. On Earth, sleep is always in agreement with weight. A mattress receives you. Blankets settle. Your body yields downward. In space, none of that works quite the same way. Astronauts could sleep while floating, restrained so they would not drift inconveniently into equipment or into one another in ways that might make for a charming comedy sketch but a less charming mission log. Imagine closing your eyes and resting while your body hangs in midair, held lightly in place inside a vessel moving toward the moon. It sounds unreal, and yet for the crews it had to become normal enough to survive. Spaceflight has a talent for turning the unbelievable into Tuesday. Meals were similarly practical, and perhaps a little less glamorous than the word meal normally suggests. Nobody was setting a table and discussing the bouquet of the vintage, unless the vintage was freeze-dried chicken salad and the bouquet was determined optimism. Food had to be stored, prepared, and eaten in ways that kept crumbs and liquids from wandering into systems that would strongly prefer not to be seasoned. Even so, eating carried comfort. Routine meals are one of the oldest human signals that things are under control. We are still here. The world, or in this case the spacecraft, continues. There is time to eat. Those ordinary acts matter because they kept the moon from becoming a purely abstract goal. The mission was not just a line on a map from Earth to lunar orbit. It was lived minute by human bodies with appetites, fatigue, habits, moods, and the ongoing need to stay sharp in an environment that offered no forgiveness for carelessness. That contrast gives the crossing much of its emotional power. The scale is cosmic. The experience is deeply domestic in miniature. You travel toward another world while managing your checklist, your food pouch, your sleep, your posture, your tools, and your own thoughts. The crews also had to perform small course corrections from time to time. Spacecraft do not simply point themselves with noble determination and trust fate. Tiny adjustments mattered. A slight burn at the right time could refine the trajectory and keep the spacecraft on the path needed for lunar arrival and, later, safe return. These maneuvers were not loud in the way launch was loud, but they carried quiet significance. A brief engine firing in the void, a change in speed so precise it would have seemed like sorcery a century earlier, and the ship continued onward. Human beings had learned how to steer between worlds with measured nudges. That alone deserves a long, respectful pause. And all through this coast, there was the steady companionship of mission control. The astronauts were far from Earth, but not detached from it. Radio links connected them to voices back home, voices that were often calm, dry, technical, and wonderfully human. Those exchanges have a comforting quality. They remind you that the mission was never three men alone in an abyss. It was an entire web of people supporting them, thinking with them, checking behind them, solving with them, and occasionally talking in the understated way professionals do when everyone knows the stakes and nobody feels the need to perform emotion for the transcript. As Earth receded and the moon slowly claimed more of the future ahead, the crossing became something deeper than transit. It became a corridor of perspective. Space stripped away clutter. The astronauts were enclosed in a machine not much bigger than a patient thought, suspended between the world that made them and the world they were about to meet. The usual furniture of life was gone. No streets, no weather against skin, no smell of trees or pavement or coffee from another room. Just systems, voices, bodies, memory, and the black outside. Perhaps that is why this part of the journey feels so calming to imagine. It was a rare human state, total commitment without constant noise. The hardest departure was over. The most dangerous destination still lay ahead. Between them stretched a period of pure movement, quiet work, and expanding wonder. The spacecraft coasted. The crew floated. Earth shone behind them. The moon waited ahead. And inside that tiny cabin, day by day, the impossible became familiar enough to live in. Somewhere in that long, quiet crossing, after the body had adjusted to floating and the rhythms of life inside the spacecraft had become almost familiar, another comforting truth came into focus. Getting to the moon was not a matter of aiming boldly and hoping the universe admired your confidence. It depended on knowing exactly where you were going, how fast you were moving, and how tiny changes made across enormous distances could decide everything. The remarkable part is that this celestial navigation, which sounds intimidating enough to ruin a perfectly good nap, was often carried out with an elegance that feels almost old-fashioned. For all the futuristic glamour of moonflight, some of the most important guidance depended on skills that would not have seemed entirely strange to an earlier age of seafarers. You looked at stars. You trusted instruments. You checked your position. You corrected gently. You kept going. That blend of ancient instinct and modern precision gives this part of the story its special charm. Human beings have been navigating by the sky for thousands of years. Sailors crossed oceans using stars as companions and reference points, long before digital screens began bossing everyone around. The Apollo crews were doing something grander and much more difficult, but the core idea still had that same beautiful simplicity. The heavens were not just scenery, they were a map. Inside the spacecraft, guidance began with systems that could sense the vehicle's orientation and motion. The astronauts were not looking out the window every few minutes and saying something like, "Yes, the moon seems to be over there. Excellent, full speed ahead." The spacecraft carried an inertial guidance system, which is a very dignified way of saying it knew its own motions without constantly asking the outside world for help. Once aligned properly, it could track how the spacecraft turned and accelerated. That mattered enormously because in the emptiness between Earth and Moon, there are no painted lanes, no roadside signs, no convenient gas station clerk pointing vaguely east. Still, even the best internal system needed checking. Space is too large and mistakes too patient for anyone to rely on a single stream of confidence. So the astronauts had ways to confirm where they were by observing stars. There were complications, naturally, because the universe prefers not to make history too convenient. The spacecraft could be flooded with sunlight at certain angles. Reflections could interfere. Particles or bits of debris outside could momentarily look star-like and try to impersonate useful navigation aids, which is a wonderfully rude trick. Imagine trying to navigate to the moon while tiny flecks outside your window make themselves look important. The astronauts had to know the difference. They learned the sky. They learned the behavior of the spacecraft. They learned how to trust instruments without becoming helpless before them. That balance is one of the deepest forms of competence. And then there was the computer. The Apollo guidance computer has become legendary, partly because it was brilliant for its time, and partly because modern people enjoy the slightly unsettling realization that a journey to the moon was guided by computing power that would not impress a current toaster. This comparison is repeated so often because it remains deliciously absurd. The computers involved in Apollo were nowhere near what people now carry in their pockets, yet they helped send human beings to lunar orbit and back. It is a reminder that intelligence is not only about raw power. It is also about design, efficiency, priorities, and not wasting resources on unnecessary nonsense. The Apollo computer did not need to stream cat videos. It had focus. Inside the spacecraft, the computer worked with the guidance systems to track position, velocity, attitude, and plan maneuvers. It was not a magical brain taking over while the astronauts lounged nearby with the relaxed confidence of well-dressed passengers. They interacted with it. They entered commands. They monitored results. They understood what it could do and what it could not do. This partnership between human judgment and machine precision is one of the most reassuring features of the moon missions. Neither side worked alone. The computer was powerful within its role. The astronauts remained deeply engaged. Mission control stayed linked from Earth. The whole architecture of guidance was layered, which is exactly what you want when failure is not one of the recommended options. The interface itself was famously concise, almost stern. No glossy icons. No reassuring animation. No helpful little message asking if you're still sure you want to proceed to the moon. Just codes, verbs, nouns, and disciplined entry. It required training and clarity. There is something admirable about that. The language between human and machine had been stripped to essentials because essentials were what mattered. In the soft glow of the cabin, with the Earth receding and the moon drawing nearer, astronauts typed short command sequences into a computer and trusted that the mathematics underneath would guide them true. It sounds austere, but also strangely intimate, like a quiet conversation between concentration and destiny. Mid-course corrections were where all of this careful navigation became visibly important. The spacecraft did not need great dramatic turns. It needed small, precise adjustments. That is one of the most soothing facts about the trip. Even a journey to the moon often depends not on wild heroics, but on gentle refinement. A slight drift in trajectory, if ignored, could grow over distance. A carefully timed engine burn, by contrast, could nudge the craft exactly where it needed to be. The scale is immense. The corrections are often modest. There's a lesson in that, and the universe is smug enough about it that one almost has to admire the delivery. These mid-course corrections required calculations, verification, and confidence in position. If the numbers were off, the burn could be off. If the burn was off, the arrival could be wrong. So the guidance work surrounding even small maneuvers mattered intensely. A crew might receive updated data from Earth, compare it with onboard readings, verify the spacecraft's orientation, and then conduct the burn with the calm seriousness of people who know that subtlety is not the opposite of importance. Sometimes the smallest decisions carry the farthest consequences. Mission control, of course, remained a central partner in all this. On Earth, teams tracked the spacecraft and computed its path with extraordinary care. The communication between astronauts and ground controllers often had a dry, low-key tone that makes the whole thing feel even more impressive. Nobody needed to sound poetic. The poetry was already happening. Calm voices exchanged information across space. Numbers were read back. Corrections were confirmed. Solutions were discussed with the kind of precise understatement that only highly trained people can produce while participating in one of the most astonishing journeys in history. There is comfort in that understatement. It tells you that the mission was being held not by theatrical emotion, but by competence. The drama existed, certainly. Space contains plenty of it, even when everyone remains calm. But guidance depended on people who could look at immense distance and reduce it to something manageable, who could translate the wild fact of moon travel into headings, alignments, and burn durations. They were making the cosmos legible. The stars themselves added a particular kind of beauty to this work. Seen from space, without Earth's atmosphere to make them twinkle, stars could appear sharper and steadier. That steadiness mattered. It gave the crews fixed points against which to measure their orientation. There is something deeply moving about that image. Human beings, enclosed in metal and glass, crossing a gulf of darkness, using ancient fires scattered across the universe to keep themselves properly aimed at a nearby world. It feels almost ceremonial, as though the older cosmos had agreed to assist the newer travelers. And all the while, the moon was becoming more than a target. It was turning into a place with a relationship to their path. Navigation is never just about the destination. It is about the continuous act of staying true on the way there. Each confirmed position, each aligned platform, each verified star, each accepted calculation turned the voyage from bold aspiration into an actual, unfolding arrival. The spacecraft was not simply moving. It was being guided with exquisite patience. This is why the navigation of the moon missions can feel so restful to hear about. It replaces the fantasy of reckless adventure with the beauty of careful thought. The astronauts were not racing blindly into the unknown. They were reading the sky, consulting instruments, speaking with Earth, and making measured decisions. The old human habit of looking upward for direction had survived all the way into the space age. Only now it was wrapped in circuitry, software, and a cabin moving through deep space. By the time the spacecraft drew nearer to the moon, all those quiet acts of orientation had already done their work. The stars had helped steady the path. The computer had held its discipline. The crew had verified and adjusted. Mission control had tracked and advised. Across hundreds of thousands of miles, nothing had been left to wishful thinking. That is the calm hidden inside the grandeur. The moon could be reached because people had learned how to move through mystery without surrendering to it. And out ahead, growing larger with infuriating lunar composure, was the gray world they had been guiding toward all along, waiting in a silence so complete that even radio would soon have to bow before it. That silence begins before anyone says much about it, because the moon has a way of absorbing noise even when you're still some distance away. From far out, it can look almost simple, just a gray-white sphere with familiar dark markings, the old face from Earth that generations learned to recognize without ever touching. The closer the spacecraft comes, the less simple it becomes. Its surface starts to gather texture. The smooth idea of the moon gives way to a harsher, more intricate reality, and the crews approaching it would have felt the emotional temperature of the journey change once again. The crossing through deep space had its own quiet rhythm, but lunar arrival carried a different kind of stillness. It was the stillness of approaching a world that has no weather, no air, no rustling leaves, no oceans, no birds, no accidental softness at all. Just rock, dust, sunlight, shadow, and age. The maneuver that brought Apollo into lunar orbit was one of those deeply elegant moments in spaceflight where everything depends on timing and trust. The spacecraft did not simply drift up to the moon and decide to stay. It had to fire its engine at just the right time, using the moon's gravity and the burn itself to trade speed for capture. Too little, and the spacecraft might not settle into orbit as planned. Too much, and the shape of that orbit would shift in ways nobody would find charming. What feels so calming about it, oddly enough, is how deliberate it was. After all the long preparation, the navigation by stars, the patient tracking from Earth, the moon finally began to exert its own quiet influence, pulling the spacecraft into its presence. And once that orbit was achieved, the crews entered one of the most hauntingly beautiful phases of the entire mission. Lunar orbit is not loud in imagination the way launch is loud. It does not arrive in public memory trailing flame, but it has a mood unlike anything else in human experience. You are no longer traveling between Earth and moon. You are circling the moon itself, suspended above a world that looks ancient beyond ordinary understanding. Craters spread across the surface in overlapping rings and scars, some small and precise. Others so enormous they seem more like geological thoughts than simple impacts. Ridges cast long shadows. Plains of hardened lava lie dark and flat in places, while brighter highlands gleam with a colder intensity. The surface appears at once dead and full of history, as if every mark on it has waited billions of years for someone to arrive and notice. From orbit, the moon has no atmosphere to soften anything. There is no haze between observer and ground, no blue veil, No trembling moisture in the air. The edges are clean. Shadows are sharp. Sunlight falls with almost startling severity. If Earth, seen from space, can look alive and breathing, the moon looks perfectly composed. It is a face that does not blink. That visual clarity must have been mesmerizing. Astronauts could look down and see details with a kind of intimacy impossible from Earth. Craters within craters. Runnels. Bright ejecta rays streaking across the surface. Slopes and boulder fields, and the subtle differences between one terrain and another. The moon that had once been a symbol hanging over cities was suddenly beneath them as topography. Real ground. Ground they might soon land on, if all continued to go well. There's a special thrill in that moment, when a destination stops being abstract and becomes specific enough to inspect. Yet what gave lunar orbit its most unforgettable quality was not only what they could see, but what they could no longer hear. When a spacecraft passed behind the moon, the solid body of the lunar globe blocked radio contact with Earth. This was not a metaphorical silence. It was literal. No voices from mission control. No easy check-ins. No immediate line back home. The far side of the moon was, for a few stretches at a time, a place where the crew truly slipped beyond direct contact with the planet that had sent them. That must have felt eerie, even for people trained to handle eeriness as part of the job description. There is something wonderfully strange about the phrase far side. It sounds poetic, mysterious, faintly theatrical. In reality, it was simply the hemisphere of the moon turned away from Earth, but simplicity does not make it any less powerful. Human beings had imagined the hidden side of the moon for centuries. They had written about it, speculated about it, projected all kinds of fantasies onto it. And now astronauts were actually flying over it in a machine built by thousands of ordinary humans with slide rules, soldering irons, and very little tolerance for fantasy getting in the way of engineering. The far side looks different from the near side in ways that are quietly fascinating. It has fewer of the large, dark plains that are so familiar from Earth's view, and it appears more heavily cratered, rougher, more densely battered. From orbit, it would have looked wild and old, and somehow more private, as though it had spent its entire existence being observed by no one. When Apollo crews passed over it, they were not just seeing a hidden landscape. They were participating in one of the strangest emotional experiences in exploration. Being temporarily cut off from home, while moving above a world no human eyes had ever seen directly in person before. And still, despite the grandeur of that fact, the actual work of orbiting the moon remained practical. It always comes back to that, which is part of the calming power of this story. The astronauts were not floating there to sigh dramatically at the scenery for hours on end, though one hopes they gave themselves a few moments of honest awe. They had jobs. Orbits had to be monitored, systems checked, photography performed, landing sites observed, timelines followed. This combination of wonder and routine is one of Apollo's deepest charms. History was unfolding at a scale that almost invites myth. Yet inside the spacecraft, people were still reading instruments, flipping switches, discussing procedures, and making sure nothing had quietly decided to misbehave. The moon itself, of course, offered no distractions in the earthly sense. No shifting clouds, no sudden weather fronts, no sunsets that soften into color through air. The changes came from angle, light, motion, and shadow. As the spacecraft circled, different regions slid beneath it. Sunlit craters blazed with clarity. Shadowed interiors became dark enough to look bottomless. Mountain ranges rose in pale ridges. The horizon curved gently and nearby at once, a reminder that this world was smaller than Earth, yet no less worthy of astonishment. The visual rhythm of orbiting was hypnotic. Surface, horizon, black sky, surface again. Black sky is important here. On the moon, there is no blue overhead, no atmosphere to scatter light into the familiar dome of day. Even in full sunlight, the sky is black. Imagine looking down at a brilliantly lit landscape while above it hangs the same deep darkness that belongs to interplanetary space. The contrast is severe and beautiful. It gives the moon an almost theatrical stage quality, as though the surface has been lit for a performance against a backdrop of endless velvet. For the crews, one of the most emotional sights from lunar orbit was Earthrise. The word sounds simple, but the experience must have been extraordinary. Because the astronauts were orbiting the moon, there were moments when Earth would appear above the lunar horizon, blue and white and luminous against the black. Not rising in the usual sense from the moon's surface, but appearing as the spacecraft's path carried it into view. After all the closeness of the mission, after launch and coasting and navigation and approach, here was home revealed again as an object in the sky of another world. Small enough to frame in a window, bright enough to command the soul immediately. It is difficult to overstate how moving that sight must have been. Earth was not beneath them anymore in the ordinary way. It was out there, suspended above the barren moon like a promise. Everything familiar existed on that glowing sphere. Every language, every childhood memory, every ordinary afternoon, every rainstorm, every cup of tea, every late bus, every quarrel, every reconciliation, every dog asleep under a table, every radio station, every wedding photo, every field and mountain and crowded street. And from lunar orbit, all of it could fit into one shining view. That is not merely beautiful, it is corrective. It rearranges your sense of scale and importance with extraordinary efficiency. The moon, by contrast, remained impassive. It did not care that it was being admired or approached. It did not offer welcoming colors. It did not soften its extremes for human comfort. That aloofness is part of what makes it relaxing to contemplate. There is no drama in its behavior, only in our response to it. The moon is calm because it is utterly itself. It does not perform. It simply exists in silence, marked by time. Of course, not every moment in orbit was emotionally expansive in that grand, poetic way. Spacecraft are still spacecraft. People still need rest, coordination, food, and discipline. In lunar orbit, especially on landing missions, the crew's roles became more focused. Soon the lunar module and command module would have to separate. 2 astronauts would descend. One would remain in orbit alone. Even before that happened, the shape of the mission was changing. The moon was no longer just a place to arrive at. It was becoming a place to operate around, a gravitational partner in a choreography of engines, docking plans, rendezvous calculations, landing trajectories, and return possibilities. All of that was dense with technical detail, but beneath it lay a quieter truth. Human beings were learning how to work calmly in the presence of another world. Perhaps that is the most soothing fact of all about lunar orbit. It proved that awe and competence could coexist. The astronauts could look down on a landscape older than almost anything on Earth and still remember the next procedure. They could lose contact with home and remain steady. They could cross over the far side, move through real and complete radio silence, and continue their tasks with professionalism rather than panic. They could watch Earth rise over the moon and still keep the mission on schedule. The grandeur did not overwhelm them. It deepened them. And when the spacecraft swept once more behind the moon, home's voice would fall away again. No chatter, no confirmation, no comforting link to Houston for those minutes. Just the hush of the cabin, the restrained sounds of systems doing their work, and the gray world below moving silently through sunlight and darkness. In those intervals, the moon became what it had always been and what it had never been before at the same time. A remote companion in the sky, and a real place under human orbit. Somewhere below were the landing sites, waiting with all the patience of stone. Somewhere beyond the horizon was Earth, bright and alive. Between them moved this small spacecraft, carrying its crew through one of the loneliest and most magnificent views anyone had ever known, circling a silent world with enough calm to make history feel almost hushed. And then, after all that circling silence, The mission narrows into something almost impossibly intimate. A whole species has spent years building rockets, guidance systems, control rooms, checklists, training programs, and enough machinery to keep anxiety very well employed, and all of it is about to come down to a few people in a small craft descending toward a patch of gray ground. The scale of the effort remains enormous, but the feeling becomes personal. Windows matter. Shadows matter. Altitude calls matter. Engine, throttle matters. The moon, which from orbit looked broad and ancient and serenely unbothered by human ambition, is suddenly close enough to examine by the angle of the slope, the brightness of a crater rim, the way dust might behave under the landing engine. The lunar module itself had a look that still feels wonderfully improbable, as if someone designed a moon machine by asking a brilliant engineer to ignore every instinct learned from elegant aircraft and simply make something that could survive vacuum, land gently, and leave again. It had thin legs, angular panels, foil-covered surfaces, and a fragile appearance of an object that should be handled with reverence and perhaps not exposed to any wind at all, which was ideal since the moon had thoughtfully arranged to provide none. It did not need to glide through air or look graceful on a runway. It needed to do one strange, specific job in a place where ordinary beauty had very little authority. When two astronauts transferred into that lunar module and prepared to separate from the command module, the emotional geometry of the mission changed again. One craft became two. One crew became two groups with different fates for a time. One astronaut remained in orbit, keeping lonely watch above, while the other two began the descent. That separation has a softness and attention to it. It is orderly. It is planned. It is still a moment when people part company around another world. Then the descent begins in earnest, and the moon stops being scenery altogether. The surface rises in the windows with unsettling honesty. Craters slide by. Landmarks appear and shift. The guidance computer works. The radar feeds data. The descent engine fires beneath them, not with the theatrical violence of launch, but with the steady insistence of a machine try to turn falling into landing. That difference matters. The moon does not welcome you with atmosphere or drag. There is no thick air to lean against, no clouds to cross, no runway to find. You descend in vacuum under precise control, balancing momentum and gravity in a slow negotiation with a silent world. The astronauts had to read the landscape quickly. The chosen landing area might appear acceptable from maps and orbital photography, but from lower altitude the truth could look far less cooperative. Boulders, crater fields, unexpected roughness. The moon had not prepared a smooth, ceremonial platform with a tasteful sign and good lighting. It remained lunar, which is to say beautiful, severe, and completely uninterested in being convenient. This is one of those places where the story stays gripping without needing loud words. A tiny craft hovers above ancient dust while humans decide exactly where history may safely sit down. And then at last it does. The landing itself is easy to imagine as a heavy thump, something dramatic and obvious, but it was gentler than that. The lunar module settled onto the surface with the kind of contact that had to be felt more than celebrated. A little sway, a little confirmation. Contact lights. Engines stop. You are there. The machine built on Earth is standing on the moon. Beneath the landing pads lies ground that has waded through billions of years of impacts, darkness, sunlight, and perfect stillness. Inside the cabin are two human beings listening to their own breathing, their procedures, and the astonishing fact that the descent is over. That first pause after landing feels especially beautiful. Before anyone climbs down, there is this small island of human life resting on an airless plane. Systems are checked. Suits are prepared. Voices remain professional, because professionalism is often the best container for emotion when emotion is too large to handle directly. Outside the windows, harsh sunlight, black sky, greater rain. No movement, no sound. The moon does not rush to acknowledge its visitors. It simply holds them. And then comes the hatch. It is hard to overstate the elegance of that moment. The first human descent to the lunar surface did not happen with a heroic leap into an orchestral soundtrack. It happened through a hatch, down a ladder, with deliberate movements made inside a bulky suit designed to keep a delicate creature alive in a place that would otherwise settle the matter almost instantly. That is one of the soothing truths of the moon landings. Even their most famous moments remain grounded in practical motion. Handholds, boots, steps, care. The astronaut descending the ladder is not merely making history. He is testing the reality of another world with the soles of his boots. He reaches the footpad, studies the surface, continues down, and then there is that first contact between a human foot and lunar ground. No gras compresses. No gravel crunches in any ordinary way. No wind moves across the suit. The dust takes the mark and keeps it. The moon receives the footprint with complete silence. That silence is one of the great calming facts about the lunar surface. There is no air to carry sound. So even though the astronauts could hear one another through radios, the world around them remained absolutely mute. Every movement happened inside a personal envelope of machinery and breath. The suit's life support systems hummed. Communications clicked in the ears. The heart worked. The moon itself said nothing. Imagine working outdoors in total stillness, with no rustle, no bird call, no distant traffic, no leaves, no insect buzz, no weather, not even the consoling nonsense of a breeze. Just light, shadow, and the presence of ground. And what ground it was! Lunar soil, often called regolith, was not soft in the earthly sense, though the upper layer could be fine and powdery. It was the product of eons of impacts breaking rock into tiny sharp-edged fragments. No water and no wind had rounded those grains into something friendly. The dust was dry, clingy, and persistent, with a texture unlike the loose soils of Earth. When astronauts moved through it, their boots pressed clear impressions that looked almost startlingly crisp. The footprints did not blur. Nothing on the moon was going to come along later with a gentle rain and tidy everything up. There is something wonderfully haunting about those prints. A footprint on Earth is a temporary event. Mud dries, water fills it, wind softens it, grass grows through it. Another person steps over it. Time erases it with cheerful efficiency. On the moon, a footprint can endure on timescales that make human scheduling feel adorably optimistic. Those first steps entered dust that had lain there for ages beyond easy comprehension, and in return the dust kept the memory. That exchange feels almost ceremonial. Human life, brief and warm and hurried, met a landscape of enormous stillness, and the stillness agreed to remember. Low gravity changed everything about movement. The moon's gravity is only about a sixth of Earth's, and the result was not graceful floating in the dreamlike way people sometimes imagine before they meet actual hardware. The suits were stiff. The backpacks were substantial. The terrain was uneven. The astronauts had to discover what kinds of movement worked best in this strange combination of reduced gravity and cumbersome clothing. They walked, hopped, loped, adjusted, and learned by doing. Their bodies, which had evolved on Earth and trained in simulations, were improvising on ancient dust under a black sky. The way they moved has a gentle charm. Not because it was silly, though at moments it could certainly look cheerfully undignified, but because it revealed adaptation in real time. The human form was trying itself out on another world. A step that might feel ordinary on Earth became different here. Lighter, but also less stable. Momentum behaved differently. Balance asked new questions. The astronauts found that a sort of bounding gait could be efficient. Small hops worked. Care mattered. Falling was inconvenient in ways no one wanted to explore too enthusiastically, since standing back up inside a pressurized suit on the moon is not exactly a movement one practices casually between tea breaks. And yet the work continued with remarkable calm. Surface missions had tasks to complete. Samples had to be collected. Tools had to be deployed. Photographs taken. Experiments set up. The famous grandeur of walking on the moon existed side by side with the very practical business of bending, reaching, scooping, carrying, and trying not to send dust everywhere, which it absolutely intended to go anyway. That contrast keeps the story human. The astronauts were doing geology, engineering, and careful fieldwork while standing in a place that had once belonged entirely to myth. The light on the moon made everything look severe and sculpted. Without atmosphere, shadows turned deep and sharp. Sunlit surfaces could be brilliantly bright. A crater edge might blaze while its interior dropped into darkness that looked almost cut into the ground. This gave the landscape a peculiar theatricality. The terrain seemed both near and hard to judge because familiar atmospheric cues were missing. Distance could play tricks. Features looked crisp, but not always comfortably measurable by instinct. The astronauts had to rely on training and attention rather than casual visual habits learned on Earth. And above all this was the black sky. Even while standing in full sunlight, the sky remained utterly dark. That detail never loses its power. A bright surface under a black sky feels wrong in the most magnificent way. On Earth, daylight and blue belong together so completely that separating them seems like a trick. The moon offers no such softness. Sunlight arrives raw. The landscape receives it. The sky stays black. If you wanted magnificence without noise, you could hardly design it better. The astronauts themselves became moving points of color and life against that gray severity. White suits against silver dust, gold visors reflecting harsh light, shadows stretching beside them, flags and instruments appearing in a world that had never needed them before. Every gesture carried an almost ceremonial clarity because there was so little visual clutter. A person climbing down a ladder, a boot lifting from dust, a scoop entering the ground, a sample bag held open. Human presence on the moon looked small, precise, and somehow more meaningful for not being able to hide inside the usual mess of earthly surroundings. Some of the most touching details are the simplest. An astronaut pausing to look around, another commenting on the surface. The care taken not to stray from procedure, even while confronted with something astonishing. Their voices, filtered through radio and suit systems, retain the calm tone of people doing a job, which somehow makes the whole thing more moving rather than less. Ought to not paralyze them. It joined the work quietly, and the moon kept offering its old, patient grandeur. Dust stretched out around a landing site, interrupted by rocks, shallow craters, subtle rises, and the shadows of equipment. The horizon sat oddly close because the moon is smaller than Earth. The land seemed to curve away sooner than instinct expected. There was no scent out there, no air at all, but when lunar dust clung to suits and was later carried back into the cabin, some astronauts described its smell after repressurization in ways that suggested burnt powder or spent fireworks. Even that detail has charm. The moon, after all its silence, left a trace that was not floral or elegant, but dry and slightly smoky, as if ancient stone had briefly introduced itself in the language of combustion. Time on the surface was limited, which gives every action a kind of bright concentration. They were not settlers wandering freely through endless lunar afternoons. They were visitors with schedules, consumables, procedures, and a return to secure. That made their calm even more impressive. In reduced gravity, inside stiff suits, under a black sky, on dust older than memory, they still measured, collected, documented, and moved with care. The first walks on the moon were not just triumphs of courage. They were triumphs of composure. And beneath every step lay that same ancient powder, waiting, receiving, recording. Dust older than mountains on Earth. Dust shaped by collisions from ages when life on this planet had not yet begun its long experiments. Dust that held footprints the way still water holds reflected light, not by effort but by nature. Human beings crossed it briefly. They left marks. They looked back. They kept working. Above them, the black sky remained unchanged. Beyond it, invisible in daylight, Earth hung in space as the bright home to which they would soon have to return. For those moments, though, the moon was no longer only the object of songs, calendars, wishes, and distant gazes. It was underfoot. It was real in the boot, in the balance, in the awkward hop, in the dusty glove, in the ladder, in the sample bag, in the shadow cast by a human body onto a plane that had waited an unimaginably long time for that exact shape. When the hatch closed again and the outside silence was sealed away, the moon missions returned to one of their most quietly moving truths. For all the machinery, all the fire, all the history and pressure and national symbolism and giant words people like to drape over the space age, these journeys were still lived by ordinary human beings inside very small rooms. That is where the grandeur becomes tender. A mission to the moon was not only a matter of trajectories and footprints. It was also a matter of tired shoulders, dry voices, awkward meals, cramped sleep, private jokes, and the strange ache of seeing home from very far away. The lunar surface was majestic, but the spacecraft was where the astronauts had to live. Inside the lunar module, after a moonwalk, everything became immediate and practical again. Dust came in with them, clinging stubbornly to suits, gloves, boots, and equipment. The moon did not have weather, but it apparently had opinions about interior cleanliness. The regolith was fine and invasive and determined to travel. Once the cabin was repressurized and helmets came off, the astronauts were back in a little mechanical room full of switches, bags, hoses, checklists, and one another try to manage all the consequences of having briefly visited another world. There is something deeply human about that. You can leave footprints on the moon and still come back inside, trailing a mess. The lunar module itself was not spacious in any comfortable sense. Its designers had not been encouraged to add thoughtful lounges or an area for reflective stretching. Every inch had a purpose. The cabin was a working compartment, shaped by mass limits and survival needs rather than by any generous idea of personal space. Two suited astronauts inside it had to move with cooperation and patience. You could not stomp off dramatically in a bad mood. There was nowhere to stomp to. Everything was close. Your colleague was close. The wall was close. The controls were close. The reality of your own breathing was close. The moon was close. Home was very far away. And yet people adapt with almost suspicious competence. One of the most comforting facts about Apollo is how often the astronauts sounded like capable professionals sharing a mildly inconvenient workplace rather than mythic heroes floating permanently above human limitation. They joked, they teased, they found dry humor in difficult situations. They made offhand comments that, in any other setting, might have belonged to engineers delayed by weather at an airfield or colleagues trying to finish a complicated job before dinner. That tone matters. It keeps the missions from becoming stiff. It reminds you that even in the most extraordinary circumstances, people stay people. The crews brought their personalities with them. Some are more talkative, some more restrained, some quick with humor, some quietly reflective. In the transcripts and recordings, you can feel that texture. There are moments of pure professionalism, of course, because survival has a way of sharpening the value of professionalism, but threaded through the work are flashes of character. A dry remark, a lightly sarcastic comment about equipment, a small laugh, a line delivered with the kind of understatement that suggests the speaker has decided the best response to the impossible is to remain calmly unimpressed by it. That understatement can be very funny. It is also very soothing. The moon missions were filled with procedures that could have sounded unbearably severe if everyone had spoken like stone monuments. Instead, the astronauts often sounded recognizably human. You hear patience, focus, mild irritation, amusement, fatigue, and the ability to keep going. The hardware was highly advanced. The emotional atmosphere was often wonderfully familiar. Sleep, for instance, did not become poetic just because it happened in space. It remained sleep, with all the usual complications of being human, only with the added feature that you were doing it inside a spacecraft on the way to or from the moon. In the command module, during transit, the astronauts slept in arrangements that made sense for zero gravity, restrained so they would not drift into controls or into one another. In the lunar module, rest could be even more awkward. The cabin was small. The suits and gear had taken up room. The floor was not a floor in the usual emotional sense. Bodies had to fit themselves into a space designed first for function. Sometimes one astronaut might rest standing or partly supported, another in a different position, each negotiating with a machine that had no sentimental interest in human comfort. And still they slept or tried to. That effort alone makes the missions feel intimate. You can imagine someone on the moon, exhausted after work on the surface, trying to rest while surrounded by equipment, constrained by schedule, aware that every movement matters, aware too that beyond the thin walls is an airless plane under black sky. There's no soft earthly background, no rain against glass, no distant traffic, no house settling in the cold. Only fans, pumps, systems, radio, and your own thoughts. It is restful to imagine, and probably far less restful to actually do, which is one of Apollo's recurring gifts to history. It makes the difficult sound serene because the people involved were so steady about it. Eating was another reminder that the most advanced journeys can still depend on very humble rituals. Space food gets talked about as if it were a novelty item, but on the missions it was simply one more part of daily life that had to work. Food was packed, stored, rehydrated when needed, and eaten carefully to avoid turning the cabin into a floating buffet of tiny problems. No one was laying out a tablecloth and discussing ambience. But meals still mattered because meals always matter. They mark time. They steady the body. They make the day feel structured. Even deep in space, you are still the kind of creature who has lunch. That is one reason the moon missions feel more emotionally accessible than people sometimes expect. Their outer scale is immense, but their inner life is made of recognizable things. Hunger, fatigue, small comforts, little annoyances, the need to tidy up, the relief of hearing familiar voices, the wish for a drink of water, the satisfaction of finishing a task. When astronauts talked with mission control, the exchanges could be intensely technical, but woven through them was a real relationship between people. Houston was not an abstract institution. It was a room full of voices the crew came to know well. The tone could be calm, clipped, efficient, even playful. The distance was enormous. The human connection remained surprisingly close. Sometimes that closeness arrived through wake-up calls. Mission Control would occasionally send music or greetings to start the crew's day, and there is something almost disarmingly sweet about that. Imagine waking during a moon mission not to an alarm clock on a bedside table, but to a voice from Earth and perhaps a carefully chosen song drifting through the radio link. The galaxy remains silent, the spacecraft remains cramped, and somewhere far below the horizon of your current world, people back home have decided that what you need this morning is a little music and a reminder that you are not forgotten. The homesickness in Apollo is easy to miss if you focus only on triumph. These astronauts were highly trained, disciplined, and deeply mission-oriented, but none of that erased the emotional fact of distance. They missed their families. They missed Earth in ways both grand and simple. Not just the planet as a blue sphere, though that certainly had power. They missed the ordinary fabric of earthly life. Gravity, privacy, fresh air, familiar smells. The ability to wash properly without planning it like a systems exercise. The feeling of a chair receiving your weight. The luxury of not being continuously aware that machinery stands between you and a very final problem. One of the most moving realities of the moon missions is that Earth became both more beautiful and more domestic from afar. It was the great shining globe seen through spacecraft windows, and it was also home in the most ordinary sense. The place where family members were eating breakfast, sleeping, waiting, listening to reports, pretending not to worry as much as they probably were. Every astronaut carried that invisible thread with him. The moon was magnificent, but the Earth was personal. You can feel that in the way many astronauts later described seeing Earth from space. The beauty was real, but so is the recognition. That is where everyone is. That is where my people are. That is where weather has smell and mornings have birds and water runs from taps, and a person can stand outside without engineering involved. The farther they traveled from Earth, the more intimate the planet could seem. It was no longer a continent or a nation or a patchwork of places. It was one home. Michael Collins, orbiting alone around the moon while his crewmates descended to the surface on Apollo 11, offers one of the clearest examples of how human and quiet these missions could be. He has often been described in grand terms as the loneliest man in the universe. And there is some truth in the phrase, though it can sound a bit too polished, as if it were written by someone staring earnestly into a medium-priced sunset. The reality was subtler and more interesting. Collins was not collapsing under loneliness. He was working. He was managing the command module. He was focused, skilled, and fully engaged in his role. But there were still those passes behind the moon when radio contact with Earth and with the lunar module disappeared, and he was, for those intervals, physically more cut off than any human being had ever been. That fact does not need decoration. It already carries enough hush. And even then, the mission remained built out of ordinary continuities. Checklists, timelines, navigation, monitoring systems, eating when it was time to eat, resting when rest was possible. There's almost a gentle defiance in that. The universe can offer you one of the most emotionally extreme settings imaginable, and still a person will need to find the next item on the page and make sure a switch is in the correct position. Hygiene, such as it was, had to be improvised within reason. There were no showers drifting gracefully through the command module. Cleanliness came in the form of wipes, cloths, careful routines, and the acceptance that space travel would not, for the moment, be a fragrant undertaking. Hair did not blow dramatically in the lunar breeze because the moon, again, had declined to offer one. Everything about bodily comfort had to be adapted. Even using the bathroom was more system than spontaneity. Apollo deserves credit for many things, and one of them is teaching humanity that reaching another world does not exempt you from the endless practical negotiations of having a body. The crews also found comfort in little habits: reading procedures out loud, stowing tools in familiar ways, taking photographs, making observations in a steady tone. Human beings cope with the extraordinary by giving it routine edges, and Apollo is full of that instinct. The spacecraft became, not home exactly, but a temporary habitat shaped by repetition. Certain sounds would have become familiar, certain motions automatic, certain moments of the day recognizable by task rather than by sunlight or shadow. The mission created its own domestic rhythm inside metal walls. There is something especially relaxing in the way these small moments soften the boldness of the larger story. The moon missions are often remembered as symbols of ambition, competition, technology, and exploration, which they certainly were. But they were also inhabited experiences. A person floating carefully to avoid bumping a switch. A crewmate answering with dry humor. Another looking through a window for a few quiet seconds too long because Earth is hanging there and it is hard not to look. A wake-up call from home. Dust in the cabin. Food packets. Tired eyes. A laugh over the radio. The private relief when a difficult procedure works as planned. The more you notice these details, the more Apollo stops feeling like a marble statue and starts feeling like a lived journey. That is where its emotional power deepens. The astronauts were not detached symbols moving through clean lines of history. They were men carrying out demanding work while still being susceptible to wonder, fatigue, affection, and humor. They did not stop being human in order to reach the moon. Their humanity was part of what made reaching it meaningful. And perhaps that is why the missions still feel so close. Not because everyone can imagine piloting a spacecraft or standing in lunar dust, but because everyone understands the small interior life that travels with a person wherever he goes. You can cross oceans, continents, or the gulf between Earth and Moon, and still you bring the same private self, the same need for companionship, the same relief in a familiar voice, the same desire to do your work well, and then, at some quiet moment, simply look out the window and think of home. The tenderness of the moon missions becomes even more impressive when you remember how many things could go wrong. It is easy, from a distance of decades and documentaries and familiar photographs, to let Apollo harden into inevitability, as though the footprints were always waiting politely at the end of the plan, and all that remained was for history to arrive on schedule. Real missions are never that obedient. Beneath the calm voices, the crisp procedures, the polished language of mission reports, there was always risk. Not abstract, decorative risk either. Real risk, the kind that sat quietly in the background of every launch, every docking, every engine burn, every landing, every return. The moon was beautiful, but it did not offer second chances simply because the view was magnificent. What makes these dangerous moments so strangely soothing to hear about is not the danger itself. It is the way people met it. Again and again, the missions were steadied by composure. Not glamour, not chest-thumping courage, not theatrical speeches launched into the void while someone squints nobly at a control panel. Just calm minds doing the next useful thing. That tone was established before Apollo ever reached the surface. The program had already learned, in the hardest possible way, that spaceflight is unforgiving. Apollo 1 never left the ground. During a launch rehearsal in 1967, a cabin fire killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. It was a devastating loss, and it changed the program deeply. The hardware was re-examined. Procedures were redesigned. Materials were reconsidered. The spacecraft became safer because 3 men did not come home from a test that was supposed to stay on Earth. That grief lived underneath every later success. It did not vanish. It sharpened the seriousness of the work. And that seriousness mattered, because by the time missions were flying toward the moon, everyone involved understood that competence was not optional and pride could be lethal. One of the most calming facts about Apollo is that it was not carried by people who believed in luck as a method. They prepared obsessively. They simulated failures. They studied ugly possibilities. They trained until reactions became usable under pressure. When trouble appeared, the goal was not to feel fearless. The goal was to remain functional. Sometimes the problems were technical in a slow, stubborn way rather than dramatic in an explosive way. A warning light, a radar issue, a piece of equipment behaving almost correctly, which is one of the most irritating categories of behavior any machine can choose. In ordinary life, a device that is almost correct is annoying. In spaceflight, it can be the beginning of a very long day. The crews and controllers had to live inside that gap between normal and abnormal with remarkable patience. They had to ask what the signal meant, what it did not mean, what it affected, what it did not affect, and what should be done next. So much of survival depends on refusing to let uncertainty bully you into the wrong conclusion. Apollo 11 offers one of the best-known examples, and it remains gripping precisely because the response was so composed. As the lunar module descended toward the surface, computer alarms began to appear. Those famous program alarms, the kind of thing that could very reasonably make a person's heart reconsider its employment, were not the sort of detail anyone wanted during the first lunar landing attempt. Time was limited. Fuel was limited. The surface was rising closer. The entire world was listening. And inside that narrowing moment, the astronauts and mission control had to decide whether the alarms meant immediate danger or manageable overload. What followed is a masterclass in useful calm. Guidance Officer Steve Bales and others in mission control assessed the situation rapidly. The computer was overloaded, yes, but it was still prioritizing essential tasks and continuing to function. The landing could proceed. That judgment, delivered under extraordinary pressure, helped keep the mission alive. Inside the lunar module, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin remained focused. Armstrong also saw that the planned landing area was not ideal, with rocks and rough terrain ahead, and he took more manual control to guide the spacecraft toward a safer spot. Fuel ticked downward. The world collectively forgot how to breathe. The lunar module kept descending. The famous thing about that landing is not simply that it succeeded. It is that success arrived by way of disciplined thought. No one solved the moment by panicking more efficiently than usual. They solved it by understanding the machine, trusting their training, filtering signal from noise, and keeping their voices level. That alone gives Apollo its peculiar grace. The missions were thrilling not because they escaped danger through miracle, but because people kept meeting danger with intellect. Even the language of crisis on Apollo had a kind of measured economy. You listen to the recordings, and you do not hear operatic despair. You hear professionals compressing fear into procedure. That compression is almost beautiful. It tells you that civilization, at its best, can produce not just astonishing machines, but astonishing steadiness. Somewhere between the moon and Earth, or above the lunar surface, or inside a control room lit by screens and fluorescent light, people were proving that calm can be a form of courage stronger than spectacle. Apollo 12 provided another memorable test, this time only moments after launch. Lightning struck the Saturn V shortly after liftoff, and then again. This is one of those facts that sounds so rude on the part of the universe that it almost becomes funny in retrospect. You spend years building a moon rocket, light it successfully, and the sky responds by throwing electricity at it. The strikes caused alarms and knocked some systems offline or into confusion. In the spacecraft, instrument readings suddenly became bizarre and untrustworthy. On the ground, controllers were faced with a mess of unexpected data. And yet, amid all that confusion, the recovery came through knowledge and memory. Flight controller John Aaron recognized the pattern from simulation and suggested a specific corrective action, SCE to AUX. It was an obscure switch setting, the kind of detail that sounds meaningless until it saves the day. Astronaut Alan Bean knew where the switch was and changed it. Telemetry returned. The mission stabilized. It is one of Apollo's most beloved moments because it shows how much survival can depend on one person recognizing something strange, one other person knowing where to reach, and everyone else being disciplined enough not to drown the moment in noise. There is something almost tender about that chain of competence. Not glamorous, just exact. A weird problem appears. Someone recognizes it. Someone acts correctly. The mission continues. Human beings are so often at their best in these narrow passages, when drama has to yield to usefulness. Then there is Apollo 13, the mission that became famous precisely because it did not go to plan. If Apollo 11 is remembered as the first successful landing, Apollo 13 is remembered as the mission where the moon reseeded and survival became the destination. The explosion in the service module changed everything in an instant. What had been a lunar mission became a desperate effort to get 3 astronauts home alive from deep space. Oxygen was lost. Power became precious. Systems had to be rethought. The spacecraft was damaged far from Earth, and the crew's elegant route to the moon turned into a very uncomfortable lesson in resourcefulness. The reason Apollo 13 still holds such emotional power is that its drama was carried almost entirely by calm. Jack Swigert report, "Houston, we've had a problem," remains famous in part because it was so restrained. That sentence does not scream. It does not perform. It opens the door to reality with the most controlled hand imaginable. Inside that restraint is the full shock of the moment. Something serious has happened. We're very far from home. Let's begin solving it. And solving it is exactly what followed. Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, Fred Hayes, and the teams on Earth worked through cascading challenges with an extraordinary mixture of intelligence and steadiness. The lunar module, designed as a vehicle for landing on the moon, became a lifeboat. Consumables had to be conserved. Water and power were rationed. Navigation had to be performed under altered conditions. Carbon dioxide buildup became a major concern, leading to one of the most admired episodes of improvised engineering in the history of spaceflight. The famous solution involving square canisters fitted into round openings with improvised materials is often celebrated because it deserved to be. It was a triumph of practical thought under pressure. People on the ground used the materials the astronauts had available and worked out how to adapt one system to another. It was not elegant in the decorative sense. It was elegant in the survival sense, which is the better kind. Apollo 13 is full of moments like that. Not grand declarations, but concentrated intelligence. The burn procedures had to be carefully devised. The crew endured cold, discomfort, uncertainty, and fatigue. They navigated by window and Earth's appearance when systems were degraded. Teams in mission control ran calculations and rehearsed procedures before sending them up. Everyone involved seemed to understand the same central truth. If you stay useful long enough, you may stay alive long enough. That is a very human kind of grandeur. The moon remained part of Apollo 13's path, but not as a place of arrival. Instead, the spacecraft looped around it, using the moon's gravity to help sling the crew back toward Earth. There is a quiet melancholy in that image. They went all that way and did not land. Yet even that altered path gives the mission a strange beauty. The moon, silent as ever, became a partner in the return. A world once approached as a destination became part of the solution when everything changed. It is hard not to admire the cosmic irony. And still, through all this, humor survived. Not silly denial, not reckless joking in place of action, but the dry, human kind of humor that keeps panic from filling the room. Apollo crews often had that quality. It showed in minor irritations, in clipped comments, in the ability to observe absurdity without indulging it. Humor can be a form of oxygen in hard conditions. It does not eliminate the danger. It keeps the mind from shrinking under it. That mattered because danger in Apollo did not always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrived as fatigue, as mounting workload, as tiny margins, as the need to make decisions with incomplete certainty. The astronauts and controllers had to guard not only against failure in hardware, but against the more subtle hazards of stress. Rushing, fixation, confusion, the desire to simplify too soon. Calm is not only a soothing aesthetic in these stories. It is an operational tool. The lunar surface itself had moments of risk beyond the grand headlines. Suits were life support systems worn as clothing. A torn suit, a fall, a damaged connector, a problem with a hatch or ascent engine. Any of these could have changed the story dramatically. The astronauts moved carefully because they understood that reduced gravity did not erase consequences. It only changed their shape. Even simple exertion carried physical demands in a pressurized suit. Dust could cling, equipment could snag, visibility could mislead. Working on the moon required constant low-level caution, a very composed form of alertness. And then there was the ascent from the moon, which can feel oddly underappreciated because it happened after the famous footsteps. Yet leaving the surface and rejoining the command module in lunar orbit was no small thing. The ascent stage of the lunar module had to ignite properly and lift off from another world. There was no roadside assistance for that scenario. The crew depended on a compact machine doing exactly what it had been built to do. When it did, calmly and correctly, the relief must have been enormous. Though once again the expression of that relief lived mostly inside professional procedure. All through Apollo, again and again, you see the same pattern. The missions were not flawless parades. They were complicated journeys through an environment with no patience for vanity. And they succeeded because people were willing to think clearly inside moments that could have turned into panic. The most relaxing fact about these dangerous episodes is that they reveal a mature kind of bravery. Not the bravery of pretending fear is beneath you, but the bravery of carrying fear without letting it drive. That is why these stories do not merely thrill. They reassure. They show that when human beings prepare well, cooperate deeply, listen carefully, and remain teachable even under pressure, they can move through astonishing danger with grace. The close calls do not cheapen the moon missions. They make them more human, more credible, more tender. They remind you that the footprints in lunar dust were not the product of certainty. They were the product of repeated recoveries, of minds that stayed clear when the margin narrowed. And perhaps that is one of Apollo's gentlest lessons. History often remembers the grand image at the end, the boot print, the flag, the earth hanging in black sky. But hidden inside those images is a quieter achievement. People kept one another steady. People noticed the right detail. People asked the right question. People found the switch, trusted the math, rebuilt the filter, flew the damaged ship, conserved the power, and brought the crew home. Underneath all the flame and glory, the moon missions were held together by that very earthly miracle. Calm people refusing to become less useful just because the stakes were enormous. After the footsteps, the photographs, the careful sample bags, the awkward hops, the dust clinging to everything with lunar persistence, another gentle truth began to settle over the moon missions. The astronauts did not simply visit the moon and leave it untouched behind them like polite guests straightening the cushions on the way out. They left things there, not in the careless human sense of forgetting a sweater in someone else's house. Though space history does contain its share of oddly specific objects. They left tools, experiment packages, spin equipment, flags, rover tracks, descent stages, and some of the most quietly meaningful scientific instruments ever placed on another world. The moon, which had seemed so empty, began to hold traces of human purpose. That is one of the loveliest facts about the Apollo missions. Long after the crews returned home, long after the broadcasts ended and the headlines faded and the world moved on to other worries, parts of those missions remained on the lunar surface, still, silent, and patient. Some of them kept working. Some of them simply endured. Some of them became messages in the form of hardware. A few of them still answer us even now, not with voices, but with light and data and the stubborn fact of their continued presence. The moon is a very unusual place to leave anything. On Earth, the world rearranges whatever you put down. Rain falls, wind moves dust, rust forms, plants intrude, ice cracks stone, mold gets ideas, insects investigate with unacceptable confidence. Even abandoned buildings are slowly folded back into weather and gravity. The moon offers none of that. There is no air, no rain, no running water, no ordinary erosion, no drifting seasons in the familiar sense. There is sunlight and darkness, brutal temperature swings, micrometeorite impacts, radiation, dust, and a silence that seems almost ceremonial. Anything left there enters a different relationship with time. That is why the objects on the moon feel so haunting. A tool laid down in lunar dust does not begin its quick earthly slide into decay. A footprint does not fill with water and disappear. The tracks made by a rover do not soften under wind. The descent stages of the lunar modules remain where they were left, their lower sections still standing on landing sites like mechanical fossils of arrival. Flags planted by astronauts, though probably bleached and battered by radiation and extreme temperature, still mark the places where human intention once stood very clearly against an airless plane. Those landing sites are not ruins in the usual sense. They're pause scenes, and among those pause scenes are instruments that were left not merely as symbols, but as listeners. One of the most beautiful examples is the set of laser retroreflectors placed on the moon by Apollo astronauts. These are not dramatic devices in the cinematic sense. They do not glow mysteriously at night or hum with science fiction menace. They are arrays of specially designed prisms that reflect light back in the direction it came from. That might sound modest, almost shy, until you realize what it allows. Scientists on Earth can fire laser pulses at these reflectors and measure the time it takes for the light to return. From that, they can determine the Earth-Moon distance with extraordinary precision. There is something almost magical about that. Human beings placed mirrors on the moon, walked away, and for decades afterward continued to ask the moon, very politely and with lasers, exactly how far away it was. And the moon, through those quiet instruments, kept answering. Not in sentences, not in fanfare, just in timing. Light goes out, light comes back, distance becomes known. It is difficult to think of a more elegant conversation. Those reflectors help scientists refine measurements of the moon's orbit, confirm aspects of gravitational theory, and observe the slow drift of the moon away from Earth by a tiny amount each year. Even that fact carries a soft, emotional charge. The moon is inching outward from us, very gradually, in a dance governed by tides and time, while on its surface rests equipment placed there by human hands to help us measure the drift. The old companion in the sky is not fixed after all. It moves. We noticed. We left mirrors to keep track of it. That kind of science feels wonderfully calm because it does not depend on spectacle. It depends on patience. A laser pulse does not need applause. The reflector does not need maintenance crews and motivational posters. It simply sits in lunar dust and keeps faith with geometry. Across decades, across cold and heat and silence, it remains part of one of the gentlest exchanges in exploration. Earth sends a flash. The moon sends it back. Other experiments listened in different ways. Apollo crews placed seismometers on the lunar surface to detect moonquakes and impacts. If Earth has earthquakes, the moon has its own quieter internal shivers and external strikes. That alone is a soothing and slightly eerie thought. The moon is not just a dead lantern in the sky. It trembles sometimes. It reacts. It rings in its own way under stress. The seismometers left by Apollo helped reveal this hidden activity, giving scientists a better picture of the moon's interior and the ways it responds to forces large and small. There is a special beauty in the image of a seismometer sitting alone on the moon after the astronauts have left. No voices, no footsteps, no engines. Just an instrument waiting in perfect stillness for the faint signs of a world shifting under itself or being struck from above. It is the opposite of noisy science. It is science as listening. The moon had always been watched. Apollo taught us how to hear it more clearly. Some of the experiments studied the solar wind, that constant stream of charged particles flowing out from the sun. Apollo astronauts deployed collectors that briefly sampled this invisible outpouring and carried the material back to Earth for analysis. Others examined the magnetic environment, the heat flowing from the moon's interior, the properties of the surface and near-surface material, the way the dusty ground behaved under equipment and boots. Each experiment added detail. Each one chipped away at the old image of the moon as a simple, remote object and replaced it with something richer and more specific. A place with a story in its rocks, a thermal rhythm in its ground, a history written by impacts, sunlight, and long stillness. The later Apollo missions, especially as the program grew more confident on the surface, left more substantial scientific stations. Packages of instruments were deployed to operate after the astronauts departed, powered and arranged to continue observing. There is something very touching about those stations. They're the scientific version of leaving a light on. The crews came, worked, arranged the equipment, checked it, spoke with Earth, and then rose away in the ascent stage, leaving behind not emptiness but attention. The moon kept being studied after the last boot moved off. Even the vehicles and hardware that no longer functioned became meaningful once left in place. Lunar module descent stages remained as silent bases of departure. The upper stages blasted away and returned the astronauts to orbit, but the lower half stayed put, their legs planted forever in dust. Rovers from the later missions remained where they were parked, small electric vehicles resting on a world that does not offer roads, rust, or shade in any familiar earthly form. Tools were abandoned deliberately to save weight for returning samples. Equipment that had done its job stayed behind, so precious lunar rocks and soil could come home instead. That exchange feels almost poetic. Machines were left. Pieces of the moon were taken. Knowledge moved both ways. And then there are the human traces that are not instruments at all, but feel no less scientific in their own quiet way. Footpaths between experiment stations. Rover tracks curving across the surface. Bootprints leading to ladders, flags, craters, sample sites, and back again. Those marks tell stories of movement and attention. They show where astronauts paused, where they worked, where they turned, where they investigated. On Earth, such traces would be temporary. On the Moon, they linger in a suspended present. They remain as diagrams of human curiosity. One of the strangest and most comforting things about those traces is how ordinary some of them must have felt in the moment. A person carries a tool from one spot to another. A wheel turns. A boot digs slightly deeper while bending to lift a rock. No one action announces itself as eternal. But there, in the lunar quiet, ordinary fieldwork became enduring calligraphy. The moon kept the handwriting. The American flags left on the moon occupy a different emotional space. There were symbols, certainly, and public symbols at that, but even they become gentler when imagined after the crews are gone. No breeze stirs them. No crowd surrounds them. They stand in silence under fierce sunlight until darkness sweeps over them again. Whatever their later condition, whether still, standing, or fallen, they belong to the stillness now as much as to the ceremony that planted them. On Earth, flags are almost always associated with movement, weather, noise, and people. On the moon, a flag becomes a silent marker in a landscape too old to care very much about slogans. The plaques and memorial items left on some missions add another layer to this quiet archive. They speak of remembrance, of the awareness that exploration is not only technical but human and costly. Apollo carried that awareness deeply after Apollo 1. In later years, the moon would receive small memorial gestures that made the whole enterprise feel less like conquest and more like a form of witness. Human beings had gone there, yes, but they had also brought with them memory, grief, gratitude, and the need to leave behind something that acknowledged more than success. There is also a humble elegance in the trash, if one can call it that without sounding rude to history. Empty bags, packaging, worn equipment, discarded tools, containers, and items no longer needed were left to reduce mass for liftoff. Spaceflight is unsentimental about weight. If you want to bring back valuable lunar samples, something else may have to stay. That practical logic produced one of the most humanly revealing lunar facts of all. Another world contains evidence not just of our ideals and our instruments, but of our logistics. Even at the edge of impossibility, somebody still had to decide what to keep and what to leave behind. And yet nothing on the moon feels merely thrown away. The setting redeems even utility. A scoop left in dust is not just a forgotten tool. It is part of a paused act of inquiry. A rover resting where it stopped is not just parked machinery. It is a sentence that ended with a full stop rather than fading into static. A descent stage is not scrap. It is the lower half of a doorway through which people once passed between worlds. The scientific afterlife of Apollo is especially calming because it proves that the missions were not fleeting performances. They continued to produce knowledge long after the astronauts were home. Data returned from surface experiments. Lunar samples, carried back in sealed containers, transformed understanding of the moon's age and history. Scientists learned that the moon and Earth are deeply connected, likely born from a colossal collision early in solar system history. They learned more about volcanic activity on the moon, the timing of impacts, the age of different terrains, the dryness of the lunar environment, the way space weathering alters the surface. The moon became less mysterious in one sense and more magnificent in another. The better we understood it, the older and stranger it seemed. And those sample bags themselves deserve a quiet moment. Rocks and dust taken from the moon may not sound romantic at first glance. They are, after all, rocks and dust, which on Earth are not usually treated like celebrity guests. But lunar samples were and remain extraordinary. They are pieces of another world held in laboratories, examined under microscopes, dated, compared, preserved, argued over, and studied by generations of scientists who never had to wear a spacesuit to meet them. The astronauts did not just walk on the moon. They brought pieces of its deep history back into human hands. Still, there is something especially beautiful about what stayed behind. The moon kept the greater part of the story in place. The landing sites remain arranged in their quiet geometry. Instruments sit where they were deployed. Tracks continue across dust. Shadows still sweep over hardware as the long lunar day and night alternate. Sunlight pours over objects made by humans and leaves them blazing against the gray. Darkness returns and hides them again. The moon does not forget quickly. Modern spacecraft have photographed some of these sites from orbit, and the images carry a very particular emotional charge. You can see the descent stages, the rover paths, the disturbed surface around the landing areas. These are not myths anymore. They are visible traces on another world. Looking at those images feels almost like looking into a sealed room where history is still waiting. Nothing has been tidied. Nothing has been reinterpreted by weather. The stage remains set exactly where human beings left it. And perhaps that is why this part of the moon story feels so restful. It is about persistence without noise. The missions ended, but their presence did not vanish. The moon went on holding their traces in silence. Some instruments kept whispering data. Some mirrors kept answering light. Some marks simply endured as evidence that, for a few brief intervals, humans moved carefully across ancient dust and left behind not just symbols of arrival, but tools for listening, measuring, and remembering. By the time the last Apollo crew lifted away, the moon was no longer only a destination visited by brave strangers. It had become, in a small but lasting way, a place where human curiosity had taken root. Not in the lush, earthly sense with growth and weather and returning footsteps, but in the lunar sense, sparse, deliberate, enduring, and very quiet. Beneath that black sky, among the craters and the powder and the old, patient stone, our machines and our questions remained. And after all the rockets, all the alarms, all the dust, all the checklists read in steady voices, what remains is not only the achievement, but the feeling of it. That feeling is why the moon missions still glow so softly in the mind. Not because they were small, they were enormous. Not because they were simple. They were among the most complex things human beings had ever attempted. They stay with you because inside all that scale and difficulty, they somehow preserved a deep and calming human warmth. The missions never lost sight of the people inside them. They never became only machines, only politics, only engineering, only myth. They were always also 3 men in a cabin, 2 men on a ladder, 1 man alone in orbit, a voice from Houston, a meal eaten carefully, a switch found in time, a footprint pressed into ancient dust. That is a rare kind of grandeur. So much of modern life is loud without being impressive. It demands attention constantly, then leaves almost nothing behind except fatigue. The moon missions are the opposite. They were truly immense, and yet the way they reach you is often quiet. A white spacecraft against blackness. Earth rising over the moon. The missions also soothe because they keep reminding you how small and unified Earth looks from far away. That view has lost none of its power. In some ways, it grows stronger with time. When astronauts saw Earth as a blue and white globe suspended in darkness, they were seeing something obvious and revolutionary at once. Home is one place. The borders, quarrels, vanities, and endless little performances that fill human life do not disappear exactly, but they shrink into proper scale. The moon missions carried that perspective back to Earth. They returned not just with rocks and photographs, but with a calmer sense of proportion. The planet looked precious because it was precious. Still does. And perhaps that is one reason these journeys remain emotionally restorative. They move outward, but they make you love home more. They take you farther away than most stories dare to go. Then gently return your attention to simple things: breath, water, gravity, companionship, weather, the sound of voices, the comfort of ordinary rooms. The farther the astronauts traveled, the more touching the ordinary became. That is a beautiful inversion. Great distance sharpened affection for everyday life. There's another reason the moon missions continue to soothe people, and it has to do with time. They belong to a period that still feels close enough to imagine and far enough to shimmer. The hardware was mechanical and tangible in a satisfying way. Buttons were pressed, switches clicked, checklists were held in gloved hands. Computers were real, but not all-powerful. People understood the systems intimately because they had to. You can almost hear the spacecraft as places where things hummed, latched, separated, locked, vented, and responded. Nothing about the missions feels ghostly or abstract. Even their most astonishing moments are rooted in materials. Metal, fuel, glass, fabric, dust, light. This tangibility gives the story warmth. You can feel the world of it. The astronauts themselves helped keep that warmth alive. They did not behave like characters invented to make history look neat. They were dry, funny, thoughtful, disciplined, occasionally irritated, often tired, and very alive to both the absurdity and the majesty of what they were doing. Their humanity is all through the record. You hear it in the jokes, the clipped comments, the little flashes of how they allow themselves, the practical way they keep moving through the impossible. That is why the missions never become museum pieces in the mind. They remain inhabited, and even their silences are meaningful. There is the silence behind the moon, when Earth's voice drops away. There is the silence of the lunar surface, where no air carries sound. There is the silence around the abandoned instruments after the crews depart. There is the silence of the footprints, waiting in dust that does not hurry to erase. None of those silences feels empty. They feel full of distance, attention, memory, and patience. In a noisy age, that kind of silence can feel almost medicinal. The moon itself contributes to the comfort. It is stark, yes, but is not chaotic. It has no weather to surprise you, no forests to obscure, no oceans to churn. Its beauty is severe and stable. Craters, plains, ridges, shadows, light. The same features that make it inhospitable also make it visually calm. Nothing on the moon fidgets. Nothing rustles. Nothing chatters for attention. It simply receives sunlight, holds shadow, and waits. Against that stillness, human effort looks fragile and luminous, which is exactly the right emotional ratio for a story like this. The more you sit with these missions, the more they begin to feel less like a triumphal march and more like a gentle proof. A proof that mystery does not vanish when you approach it carefully. A proof that knowledge can deepen wonder rather than flatten it. A proof that large things can be done in a quiet tone. A proof that human beings are capable of carrying both ambition and tenderness at the same time. That might be the deepest comfort of all, because the moon missions are not soothing merely because they are beautiful, though they are. They are soothing because they suggest that our species is not only destructive, scattered, hurried, and noisy. We are also capable of concentration, restraint, courage, craftsmanship, and awe. We can build with patience. We can cooperate under pressure. We can leave mirrors on another world and keep asking questions for decades. We can look at a distant object that once belonged only to legend and reach it without stripping it of wonder. That is an unusually hopeful thing to know about ourselves. And the hope in Apollo is not sugary or naive. It is earned hope, Hope that has been tested by fire, by failure, by loss, by damaged equipment, by limited fuel, by loneliness, by long math, by the very ordinary stubbornness of reality. That kind of hope lasts better. It does not depend on pretending life is easy. It depends on proving that difficulty can be met with grace. So the missions endure in the imagination, not just as events, but as a kind of emotional weather. Cool, clear, spacious. They make room in the mind. They pull your thoughts upward and outward, then return them softly to earth. They let you feel both the size of the universe and the nearness of home. They let you admire giant rockets and also care about a crumb floating in a cabin, a tired joke over the radio, a hand steadying itself on a ladder. They let magnificence and intimacy stand in the same frame without fighting. That is why the old footage still works, why the photographs still hold you, why that view of Earth above the lunar horizon still seems to pause something inside the chest, why the tracks and dust still feel fresh, why the phrase moon mission continues to carry a kind of silver calm no matter how many years pass. The story has already settled into something larger than news and softer than nostalgia. It has become part of the night sky of the mind. And as the final light of it begins to soften, you can feel how gentle the afterimage really is. Not blazing, not demanding, just present. A rocket rising through thunder. A spacecraft coasting in silence. A crew reading instruments by the glow of panels. Stars used as guides. The far side of the moon swallowing radio for a while. Ancient dust holding a footprint without complaint. A mirror waiting patiently for a pulse of light from home. Earth shining in blackness, small and complete. You do not need a strain to hold any of it. You can simply let it float there for a little while longer, quiet and bright. You can let the moon return to its old place above sleeping houses and dark fields and distant shorelines, carrying with it everything you know now. That people went there, that they moved carefully, that they came home, that some part of them stayed behind in dust, in instruments, in tracks, in memory, that the distance was real and crossed anyway. And you can let your thoughts grow slower here. The sky can widen. The rooms of the world can settle. The noise of the day can move farther off, the way Earth once moved slowly away behind those crews as they crossed into the black. You can keep the gentlest parts with you, the calm voices, the patient math, the white suits against gray ground, the soft discipline of people doing difficult things well, the way the moon looked close and far at the same time, the way home looked more beautiful from a distance. There is no need to hurry past any of it. The old missions are finished, but they are still glowing faintly in the dark, like embers that do not burn the hand, only warm it. So you can rest here for a moment at the edge of that silver story. You can imagine the last light on a lunar ridge, the last quiet pass in orbit, the last glance through a small spacecraft window before the long return. You can imagine the dust lying still after the engines are gone, the mirrors waiting, the footprints resting, the moon turning on in the sky above the Earth once more. And beneath that same moon, tonight, the world is quieter than it seemed a little while ago. The air is softer. The ceiling is still. Your breathing can loosen and lengthen. Everything can become simple again. Just one planet, one moon, one old human dream gently fulfilled, and the hush that follows when something impossible has been done carefully enough to feel peaceful. Sleep can come the same way those missions came home. Slowly, surely, with the dark all around, and a small, bright world waiting for you.